Hi, this is Dr. Marcus Masson again in our series for workers' compensation knowledge advancement. This topic today will be on OSHA's mission, which is the prevention of work injuries. Now, what we hope to learn with this talk is what is OSHA and what's it all about? And who does OSHA apply to? Is there OSHA work classifications we should be familiar with? And what types of injuries and prevention should we instill at the workplace? Now, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which is OSHA, was passed by Congress back when Richard Nixon was president in 1970. And its mission is to prevent worker injury or death in the workplace. Now, the 7 core concepts and practices include leadership management, worker participation, hazard identification, assessment, and documentation, which essentially conducts inspections, based on imminent danger, fatalities, and work complaints. And finally, hazard prevention and control. The other areas are education and training programs that are given both to entry employees as well as to employees that are supervisors and managers. Evaluation and improvement programs for everything that is implemented is done on a regular basis through this documentation system, and communication and coordination by host employers are very important in order to assure that injury is prevented. Now, who does OSHA apply to? And it applies really to what we define as an employer, that under OSHA means a business owner engaged in business that has 1 or more employees. Now, this is different than who applies to reportability, and we'll talk about that a little later. But employer responsibility is to provide a workplace that recognizes health hazards and eliminates them, and also to comply with the standards and rules and regulations placed by OSHA to avoid these injuries. Now, OSHA has 4 work classification categories. One is considered the general industry, and that really applies to the highest number of workers and employee work sites. The second is construction. It's another second large area that OSHA covers, and it includes anything that involves construction or alteration and repair. Maritime employees are also included, and this is sea jobs. Anyone who is a longshoreman or works about a maritime environment is considered a classification system. And finally, agriculture, the production of produce, is very important in the 4th category. Now, if you think about work injuries and why they occur, it is one of 3 things. First, it could be an unsafe environment, and so we'll talk about the different areas of unsafe environment, but it could also be employee reasons because of lack of leadership management by employer, lack of training or poor training provided, and safety equipment cannot be provided. PPE is very important for all safety activities depending on what is being done, if it's relating to heights or if it's relating to any chemicals or asphyxiants. Finally, execution checklists should be available for every activity, and many times is not. And an execution checklist is a checklist that demands discipline by everyone not to overlook something that is frequently missed. And then employee reasons could be lack of proven competence when you hire an employee and you place them in a workplace, or lack of skills practiced by the employee once they have been taught. Communication can be an issue, and proper communication, depending on the risk of the environment, is very important. Sometimes there's a lack of focus and distraction, or lack of discipline on part of the employee. Now, the most common workplace injuries that we see are the top 10 OSHA violations in 2020, which hasn't really changed much in the last couple of years. Includes number 1, falls; 2, chemical hazard communication; respiratory protection violations; scaffolding violations; ladder violations in the construction industry; control of hazardous energy; powered industrial trucks violation; fall protection training deficiencies; eye protection; and machinery and machine guarding violations. Let's cover each of them in order to see what we need to do in order to avoid these injuries. Starting with falls, you should know that there are three types of falls. A fall that occurs in a level ground, which is single level falls, falls occurring from a height, and then ultimately swing falls when you have a harness in place and you're at a height. We'll cover each of these. The single level fall is broken down into four categories. There's a step and fall single level fall that occurs when walking on a surface that has an unexpected change in height. Examples include uneven surfaces, slopes, and dips that can actually surprise and cause an accident. A slip and fall is usually when the surface is very slippery, as when it is wet or there's some grease or element similar in the employee's shoe. A trip and fall is when an unseen and unexpected obstacle occurs, as you can see when power cords or toys are in the area. And finally, a stump and fall occurs when your foot contacts an uneven and unexpected raised area, as when you hit a carpet or rug that has an elevation or a bump in place. Now, when you look at the falls from heights, it varies, and the environment is extremely important. You should know that over 300 deaths a year occur from falls from heights. The unprotected roofs, roof edges, and leading edges is important. And roofing deaths are about 111 a year. And improper scaffolding construction or assembly has donated to approximately 60 deaths a year. Now, personally, falls from a height can be because of lack of installation of safety mechanisms. It could be related to wrong type of equipment used or lack of proper training. The swing falls are when you're having to work on a significant height and the personal fall arrest systems is not used, or is it used improperly. An example is anytime that there is a fall that occurs because you are greater than 30 degrees from forming an angle and you slip and fall, that gives you a higher impact as your weight hits the arc at a higher velocity. The longer the line also from the center of the anchor, the higher the velocity and the higher the impact on impact. The greater the arc and the higher the impact essentially can cause significant injury. So it's important to try to be right underneath, if you will, of the anchor if you can, and not to exceed those 30 degrees. In reference to chemical hazard communication, there are types of chemical hazards, and we'll talk to each of them, but the reason that they cause problems typically is related to improper labeling and improper communication. Now, the 7 types of workplace chemicals include chemical asphyxiants, corrosive chemicals, chemical irritants, carcinogens, sensitizers, reactive chemicals, and flammable chemicals. Let's start with chemical asphyxiants. Now, chemical asphyxiant in the workplace is anything that causes a gas that can be inspired by a person. This includes elements like carbon monoxide or cyanide in the environment. Corrosive chemicals are essentially visible and irreversible changes or composition of material in the body with direct contact when it's mixed. Examples include sulfuric acid and sodium hydrochloride. Chemical irritants can actually cause severe illnesses and long-term lasting effects to the person's eyes or skins or respiratory tracts when these irritants are in direct contact, or slightly water-soluble bodily reactions can occur, including redness and rashes, coughing, hemorrhaging. Examples include soaps, detergents, solvents, acids, welding fumes, and wood dust. The sensitizers are essentially things that can cause itching on exposure and contact, and includes chlorine and alkaloids that can also irritate the lungs. The next category is carcinogens, and carcinogens are well described and well known, and these are chemicals that can later cause cancer, and so we have to be aware of them. Other things besides chemical carcinogens include environmental, medical, radiation, could be viruses that you're exposed to, and some medications. So lifestyle things that we also know about and very common is smoking, obesity, and alcohol consumptions. These should all be avoided in order to get the long-term deleterious effects of cancer. The other types of chemicals are reactive chemicals that include solids or liquids that can cause hazards of explosions when mixed or combined. We must be aware of this, and this includes nitric acid or peroxide and saline when they're mixed together. Flammable chemicals are also a problem because once they ignite, they can burn, and exposed to oxygen can cause a significant burn injuries. Examples include acetone, propane, butane, and similar chemicals. The respiratory violations are essentially a lack of use of proper hooding or personal protective equipment for masks that have different protection for individuals used in vapor exposure. The scaffolding violations are several. You can use fall protection while in a basket. Don't assume that the basket is sufficient. Use a fall protection anytime you're above 10 feet. And also safe access above 2 feet is important so that you are not at risk when you do have an injury. And it's important to use all the scaffolding protection in order to avoid injury if a fall does occur. Now, full planking on all working levels is important, and essentially the higher you are, the more important that is. And essential training by qualified personnel is important to avoid scaffold type injuries. Training should be done by qualified people, and the appropriate protective equipment should be provided. The ladders are a significant violation causing injury. Most of it has a lot to do with human error that causes these accidents. For example, in this picture, you can see these gentlemen improperly standing very high on a ladder, and if it falls, it can cause significant injury depending on where they fall to. You know, throwing tools from one person to another while you're on a ladder and they're reaching for it can cause an imbalance. And then using metal ladders around electrical wires that can cause electrocution. Use of the wrong ladders for a given situation based on height and weight capacity is important. And it's important to know what the foundation or areas that you're placing ladders on so that they don't slip and slide. The slippery surfaces can be a problem. Here are some pictures above of the proper height and angle and leaning surfaces that a ladder should have. The control of hazardous energy is also important, and here the lockout tagout procedure is very important. Electrocution has caused about 9% of construction work fatalities. Now, energy resources include anything that is electrical, hydraulic, pneumatic, chemical, or thermal, or even nuclear. And the injuries are essentially, again, lack of communication. So the LODO technique, or lockout tagout, assures that you have to go through certain locks in order to have access, and the labeling is extremely important so that you know what you're dealing with and that you're dealing with something that has hazardous potential. The other methods of doing LODO encompasses machine guarding with alternative measures that include guarding that can safely protect you from moving parts in mechanical machinery. The hazardous energy sources in the workplace include electrical, and this is very important to understand so that you're properly trained and proper access is conducted with periodic inspections and audits to all of this equipment in order to assure they're in compliance. The powered industrial trucks are important. And here, not only the proper training and the purpose of each of these equipment is important, but it must also be used what it's only designed for. Trained operators should be certified, and communication, when one is giving communication to another coworker, must be clear and concise in order to avoid injury. For example, backing up or giving directions of how to load. And always remember that you must make sure that your checklist is done, particularly knowing who you're dealing with and their experience level so no injuries occur. The Fall protection can also occur if you have problems with holes in the ground that you're not actually looking at when you're walking or ambulating. The hole covers and guide rails are extremely important in order for fall protection. You have to eliminate these exposures by doing surveillance of the environment, knowing what environment you're dealing with, knowing who you have in the workplace. So that's a checklist also item that you should follow. The fall protection can include restraint mechanisms for PPE in heights, fall arrest systems, as you've seen, for when you're working above 2 feet and certainly higher, and administrative controls that are very important but are not as effective as doing the fall protection systems. It's not enough just to tell people what the rules and regulations are. We must make sure that they follow it and that we supervise correctly. The eye and face protection is important, particularly when you're dealing with material that you're grinding or material that involves exposure to debris. That's extremely important because once an eye is injured, sometimes you can never get your eyesight back. So the actual protection and knowing what equipment and what process you're doing is very important. Machinery and machine guarding we discussed, and it's extremely important to understand that unless you're careful, you understand what machinery, rotation elements are, how you start it, how you stop it, and then what the pull components are. Having loose garments and things like that in place can be of high risk. Making sure you're wearing the proper equipment, protection for your eyes, protection and masks, depending on what you're producing with this machinery. Finally, I want to thank you for this and know that these injuries or injury patterns are for you to acknowledge and understand so that you can avoid them. I thank you for your time.